Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with quite an interesting inside story. I'm going to tell you the tale, the nobody's heard this before, the untold story behind one of the most spectacular failures in the classical music business of the early 21st century. I'm talking about Andante.com. Because some of you have said, where do we get Andante records? Because you've seen them. Sometimes they still turn up used or popping around somewhere or other. And in fact, when I did the EMI Stravinsky box, you mentioned that you wanted to get some of those historical Stravinsky recordings that Andante released. And where are they? And what happened to them? And I'm going to tell you. It's a fascinating tale. It really is. So, the story begins back in the 1990s. There was a French music critic and radio celebrity. His name was Armand Panagel. Very, very famous name in France. Everybody knew who he was. You can look him up on Wikipedia. He was a big, big guy. Trust me. He had this unbelievable collection of records and films, and because he was also as much interested into moving image as he was music, but particularly classical music. He had 200,000 albums, 70,000 of which were 78s. The rest were all LPs, something like 50,000 movies, and all of this stuff was scarfed away at this property in the south of France, just outside the village of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. Really gorgeous, gorgeous place. It was a beautiful olive oil pressing factory that dated back to Roman times. A gorgeous, gorgeous piece of property. It had a courtyard. It was 4 buildings, an outbuilding, and a place for a groundskeeper. And how do I know this? Well, I'll tell you. In the 1990s, I was going to the MIDEM convention in Cannes, France. MIDEM stands for Marché International du Disque et Édition Musicale. And that is the big international, or was the big international music conference in the Western Hemisphere. And I was running the Cannes Classical Music Awards at that time. Now, one of the awardees, who was also a friend, actually, I have to say, but fortunately, I didn't vote. I recused myself. He won on his own. Was the conductor Antonio de Almeida, who I met while doing a radio show on WQXR here in New York. First hearing with George Jelinek, host. And he was one of the panelists, and I was one of the panelists. And we chatted because he was really into unusual repertoire, as I'm sure many of you know, because of his recordings for Marco Polo. And we gave him an award for his Mala-Piero symphony set. But in the meantime, he and I had become friends over the years. I donated the percussion section to the Moscow Symphony Orchestra because they needed equipment at the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, we knew each other from back. And Tony was a great guy. He is a real bon vivant, really an interesting guy. Well, it turned out that he lived in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, in the building which housed the Panagel Foundation, one of its wings. Because the way things work in France is that there is a deal there, a long-term lease deal you can get into, which will allow you to live in a place as long as you live, or for 99 years, or a very long term, provided you fix it up and pay the taxes, which is what the regional government cares about. So he had this magnificent studio apartment in what became the Panagel Foundation, in this fabulous old olive oil pressing and manufacturing facility that was just magical. It was absolutely magical. It was in the Rue des Petits Jardins, which is right off the Rue des Glaciers on the outskirts of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, which was the home of Nostradamus. I mean, it's such a great part of the world. It really is. And he invited me to come and spend a few days with him after the award. And I did that, and I did that with a colleague for 3 or 4 years. After the convention in the late 90s, we would go to Saint-Rémy-de-Provence and hang out. Now, Panagel died in 1995. and Tony died only a few years later. But the foundation became, Panagel had this idea. He was going to create this foundation. He created it as a foundation. He endowed it as a foundation because he couldn't afford to pay the taxes on the property, which of course is always an issue when you have a big property, which all of a sudden has become enormously valuable. I mean, this property was a gem. It was really a gem in a magnificent part of the world. So Panagel set the whole thing up to avoid paying taxes, basically. But when he died, his relatives could not pay the inheritance tax, and the whole property went into foreclosure. They couldn't do anything while Tony was living there because he had a life tenancy that couldn't be touched. But in France, foreclosures don't work the way they do here. The government does not want to take the property and auction it off. They want to figure out some way to get somebody in there who's going to pay the taxes, and they don't want to be bothered with it. It's a very, very different process. Napoleonic code does not work the way common law countries work. And so this property sat there while the relatives of Panagel fought to keep it. Now, what does any of this have to do with Andante? Well, enter an American lawyer named Alain Coblence. Now, Mr. Coblence is a well-known international lawyer who deals with French and American companies and their interbusiness relations. And one of his clients was Pierre Berger. Now, Pierre Berger was the lover and business partner of Yves Saint Laurent, and they were rich. I mean, you may remember they sold Yves Saint Laurent off for about $600 million. They had unlimited money, and they had beautiful homes everywhere. They had one in Marrakesh or someplace like that, or Tangiers or someplace like that. Yeah, I think it was in Tangiers. And, of course, one in Normandy. Just incredible. And Pierre Berger also, and Yves Saint Laurent, had a home in Provence, outside Saint-Rémy. And they were looking at property. They wanted to get property, or they were looking for, anyway. They stumbled on the Panagel Foundation. And so Alain Coblence talked Berger into financing what was to become Andante. Why did they do it? They did it because the deal, in order to get that property and get the Panagel Foundation, you had to agree to pay the taxes, which Panagel's family couldn't do. So he agreed to invest enough money to pay the taxes and improve the property in some way. And that was part of, in any case, the investment that he agreed to make that became Andante. Now, the taxes were paid through rent, which was very low. It was a payment over time. But the things he had to do with the foundation itself, the building and the property, that was going to be a little pricier and a little bit more expensive. And he set it up as a recording studio and home for the Panagel Foundation. And it's still in operation today, even though Berger died in 2017. All that stuff is still there. But in the meantime, he agreed to invest $5 million in Andante. And what Andante was the merchandising arm, in a sense, of the Panagel Foundation, because Andante released all these historical recordings. Where did they get those historical recordings? They got them because they were all sitting in the south of France in the Panagel Foundation, this unbelievable collection of 78s and other things which had gone public domain. They could issue them. It didn't cost them anything. And so, with the promise that the Panagel Foundation would become the crown jewel in the culture of that area of Provence, Berger, with the help of Alain Coblence, got the Panagel Foundation, and he got the property and the source of the recordings which Andante issued. So that's where the records came from. And the reason I know this is because I just started ClassicsToday.com in 1999, and we were talking about things we could do. Andante was launching in 2001. And back in 2001, there were all of these what we called portal sites. They were these hugely ambitious endeavors. They were going to be everything to everybody in classical music. You were going to have every orchestra in the world and opera house streaming their stuff live. You were going to have historical record labels being issued. People were going to subscribe. It was going to have news. It was going to have features. It was going to be everything to everyone. And there were about half a dozen of these things, and I knew most of them at one point or another. Andante was not the largest. There was another one, a competitor, that raised $12 million and blew through it in a couple of years before they went bust. There was another, one of those, who was that guy who got blown up on the boat, Lord Mountbatten or someone like that? His son had a portal site. When I met him in France at a different Meet-em convention, he wanted every single classical music site to be part of his portal. And we were all supposed to share the profits. I refused to have anything to do with it. I thought the business model was insane. Excuse me. And totally doomed to failure, as indeed happened. And I know you're saying, well, it's easy with hindsight, but no, it just didn't make any sense economically. You may think, for example, that Andante, Pierre Berger gave $5 million to start Andante. You may think that's a lot. Classical music people are poor. They tend to think that $5 million is a lot, but in business terms, it's bupkis, folks. It's peanuts for what they plan to do, and the cost to do it, to set up these websites, to maintain it, to pay for it, to acquire all the news, to have the editorial staff, to make and market a record label, all of that stuff for $5 million, you had to be out of your mind. I knew it was a loss leader. It was obvious from the start, I thought anyway. I mean, if they'd been successful, I would have been a fool. We wouldn't be having this talk. But as it turned out, I believe personally, and this is speculation on my part, that Berger invested that $5 million because for the same reason everybody did everything in France. It was a tax dodge, just like the Panagel Foundation was a tax dodge. It was allowing him to get this property in France for practically nothing, but he had to invest something. And this is part of what he invested to get it. But once that money ran out, it was gone. It was done. He could deduct it. It was a loss on his balance sheet. And believe me, he had plenty of need for taxable deductions if someone's sitting on a pile of $600 million and whatnot. And it was just impossible. The whole project was impossible. And as it turned out, you could see it coming to pieces because by 2003, 2004, the record piece of this thing was sold. It was sold to Naive, the French label Naive, which basically held on to it for a little while and then shut it down. Why? Because the major labels started doing all of their own historical reissue series, box sets. They started suing people, even for stuff that was public domain. They would go to court. They would fight to be able to do their own historical reissue series. There wasn't any place or any room in the marketplace for a product like Andante, which was enormously expensive. Remember, they were charging premium prices for this stuff. And some of it really was great, and some of it really was garbage. It was like anything else. They had some historical licensing deals with some of the major orchestras, like the Vienna Philharmonic. Some of this stuff may have been tapes that Panagel owned. I don't know personally where some of it came from, but most of it, and that Stravinsky stuff that you were talking about, came from the Panagel Foundation. But Naive bought Andante.com, the record label. In the meantime, the portal, the website, proceeded to simply self-destruct and go out of business. And Berger went on his merry way, happily ensconced in his love nest with Yves Saint Laurent until he passed away. I think it was in 2008. But when Berger died in 2017, he sold all of his artwork and stuff from all of his homes. And you can actually see, where he lived. It was palatial. It was amazing. And it was right near this foundation, the Panagel Foundation, which is now a recording studio that you can visit if you go to Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. But that, my friends, is what Andante was. And one of the reasons that these records have become so hard to find was, aside from the fact that the whole enterprise was uneconomical from a marketing point of view for recordings, for historical recordings, which Andante had no rights to, and so they would be competing with cut-rate box set reissues from everybody else. That was one thing. And the other really big thing, aside from the crazy premium price, was that the whole concept was going to be of limited duration. I do not understand why Naive even bothered to buy the stuff, because, as you know, basically as soon as they did, they shut it down, and it has not recovered since. It was built to fail, in my opinion, and the reason it was built to fail is because it was advantageous from a tax point of view for Pierre Berger. I mean, I don't know if that's true. I'm only speculating. But that's what I think was happening with the behind-the-scenes economics. And if you go back and look up Andante.com in 2001, the announcement that it was being founded, I mean, the claims were so insane and so grandiose because you had this rich guy behind it with deep, deep pockets, and and everybody was just starry-eyed because of the cultural afflatus that surrounded it. But there was no hard business model behind any of it. And then of course, you read about it's closing in 2006. And then, of course, it's the usual articles. Well, is this the fate of classical music? And is classical music going to survive? And what's going to happen? Well, what happened was streaming audio, which none of these people took into account at the time, which you can't blame them. It didn't exist. It really didn't. It was in its infancy. And so, all of this historical stuff that you can get for free on YouTube now, or most of it. I mean, Andante was trying to get you to spend $20 a disc for it. You'd have to be crazy, right? I mean, that's what happened to it. So part of it was market forces, part of it was bad judgment and bad planning, and part of it may have been a very deliberate attempt simply to give Pierre Berger some tax losses to make the government in Provence happy to give him this amazing piece of property, and also, not incidentally, to preserve the Panagel collections, which are beautiful. I mean, he had the largest collection of vinyl in France, possibly in the Western world, the largest private collection of vinyl. And apparently it's all still together. I mean, you had to go to this place. It was amazing. It really was. I had such a good time there for the 3 or 4 years. I had the opportunity to spend time with Tony, just hanging out there and looking at all the stuff. And the funniest thing about it was my first meeting with Alain Coblence, who, wanted, of course, to have Classics Today somehow involved in Andante, and I wasn't interested. But we had a chat. We were cordial, and he said he had a secret source of all the great sources, the great recordings in the universe that had ever been done, and it was sequestered somewhere hidden in the south of France. And I said to him, "Oh, you got your hands on the Panagel Foundation?" And he went, "What? How do you know? Oh my God!" That's what it was. So the reason you can't find those Andante recordings is because they don't exist anymore. Naive has the rights to them, apparently. I'm not sure it would make any sense for them to revive them. Certainly not at the price point that they used to have. And they had some real packaging issues, too. I don't know if any of you remember them, but they were in heavy black. I have them in the overflow room. Heavy black cardboard with, gatefold paper sleeves that had sticky gummy stuff, gluing it all together that would get on the CDs. Some of them were really a mess. I mean, they had huge problems in producing product. They had huge problems with the website, with the portal, with the subscriptions, with everything. Basically went wrong. And once they spent their $5 million, which took about 15 minutes, that was it. But that was the end of the story. So I hope this little chat has given you some enlightenment on what was behind what was perceived as a failure at the time, but which may actually have worked entirely according to plan, for all we know. You have to remember, we don't know the motivations of individual rich people who are subsidizing some of these things. If a business is a business, it's operating for a profit because people need to survive and make a living, it's going to behave one way. When one fabulously rich person does something on a lark, we have no idea what they may be thinking or what the actual economics are. And that it was a very, very interesting lesson for some of my colleagues, especially my colleagues who actually worked for Andante and who really believed in it and who took its failure and closure very, very hard, because there was a wonderful product made for that website, for that portal site. Beautiful stuff, well worth looking at. I enjoyed a lot of it, but it wasn't made to last. Ironically, because the whole point of putting something on the internet and on the web was that it would last forever. Well, nothing is forever. In the meantime, we can keep on listening. So thank you for joining me for this little chat. I hope you found it interesting. Take care.